and welcome to the Africa Weekly Talk. Today's subject on the docket is about the term African American. The term African American, which was coined by Jesse Jackson in 1988 at a press conference in Chicago in relation to African Americans, Black Americans, going back to their heritage of the pride and proud of African civilization, has also caused a lot of controversies about the term African American in Black communities, African communities, and Caribbean communities as a whole. Basically, Black people in the diaspora. Now, out of this controversies also came Smokey Robinson in an interview with Chris Wallace of CNN, where he talked about why he despised being called African American. Fellows, let's hear from Smokey Robinson in his own words, and I'll get back to you guys after this.
You have said that you resent the idea of being called an African American.
Yes.
You are a Black American.
Yes.
Explain.
I think that when they call Black people who were born and raised for generations in this country, if you accept the handle of African American, that says that you don't accept being an American American. You don't accept being born in Chicago, or New York, or Detroit, or wherever you were born. For generations, your family has been here, built this country too. Sweat and tears and all that, fought in every war, okay? So this is my country here. So I don't want to be called African American. I'm an American American. My people have died and done everything for this country.
Well, you just heard Smokey Robinson in an interview with CNN Chris Wallace talking about why he despised being called African American. And he made a very solid point in terms of looking at his ancestors dying for this country and building this country. He doesn't understand why he has to be relegated to his ancestral homeland, which is Africa, whilst Europeans who are not called European Americans are called American American. So he wants to be called American American too. But he also has to understand the context under which the term African American came to be. The term African American came to be because of the history of America and slavery and Black people in America as a whole. And if you look at the history of America, when Blacks were not considered as American citizens until the 14th Amendment, even after that, long after that, before Black Americans were considered citizens. So you had the terms like Negro, which in Spanish and Portuguese means Black, being used, and the N-word, and Blacks being treated as second-class citizens. So people like Jesse Jackson during the 60s, when the mantra, the old mantra of I'm Black and proud, and the Afro and all that stuff, people wearing dashikis and showing the pride of Africa in Black communities and all that stuff, decided in 1988 that being called Black was not enough respect for the African American. And if other people in America, the whites, can trace back their ancestral homes to Europe, then it is time for African Americans also to trace back their heritage to Africa, to the pride of Africa, the great ancient Black civilizations of Africans, all the way to Egypt, Mali Empire, Songhai Empire, the Nok civilization, and all of that, the Moors and everything. So if we want to go back and be accepted in America with pride, then let's also go back to our heritage, the great heritage of the Africans or the African civilization that pretty much gave the world its modern civilization. So he coined the term African American as befitting for the Black man in America to be called African American. But for some reason, Also out of the brainwashing and the indoctrination of most African Americans in America about Africa. I mean, in terms of the narratives that has been portrayed in the news media in America, that negative narrative of Africa, that has also created this perception among African Americans, I mean, Black Americans in America, who don't want to be associated with all that negative stuff that they see on TV, in the media about Africa in terms of poverty, illness, and all that stuff. So to them, being called African American or anything being associated with Africa to them is negative. So I can understand why some of these Black Americans despise the term African American. And out of most of them, I would say out of ignorance. Out of ignorance, period. Because if you know the ancient history of African civilization to the world today, then you can understand why people like Jesse Jackson, W. Du Bois, Malcolm X, and all those people will want you guys to trace your heritage and be proud of that great African heritage and use the term African American. So I can understand why Jesse Jackson wants to use that term. I can understand why he coined that term. And finally, the federal government and city governments and pretty much all American communities and official documents now have African American in terms of when you are filling out application for loans or for jobs or anything that you do, there's a checkbox of African American or Black American or whatever on that paper that you fill out for employment and so on and so forth. But even going back to the history of this African American term, it wasn't even Jesse Jackson that pretty much came up with this term. This term existed in the Oxford English Dictionary in the 18th century. And also even the Philadelphia sermon that was done by an African American, Black person in America in 1835, published in the Philadelphia, was described in that publishing as an African American sermon by an African American, which is still in the Harvard Houghton Library. So this term goes way back. Because if you look at the history of Africans, slaves in America, when first slaves were brought to America, they were not called Blacks. They were called Africans. They were called African slaves. So if you go back to 16th, 17th century publishings in American newspapers and all that, you see African slaves. They weren't called Blacks. The term Black, Negro, and all that stuff came later, and then the N word, depicting the inferior Blacks as inferior, were the terms that was used out of racist, bigot 18th century writers. And out of that, it created this notion that Africans were inferior to the white man. But up to the early mid 18th and 19th century, when people were talking about the movement of Marcus Garvey, of going back to Africa and all of that stuff, it started bringing back the pride of the African in America. But there's also one thing that he said in that interview, or he said before, previously, he has said that previously, talking about how Africans, Black people were in America even before slaves were brought here. And this talk about Blacks were in America before slaves were brought here, you hear about it. It's very, very prevalent in the Black community, in some Black communities. And you hear people talking about that no, not all my ancestors were slaves and all that stuff, which is true. And I get that. But let me also tell you guys a little history about that. The Africans that were here before Columbus, so-called Columbus, discovered America, were Africans who migrated from the Guinea, Senegal, crossed the Atlantic to South America and North America eventually. And according to Christopher Columbus himself, and even other Spanish explorers and Portuguese explorers, in their own journals, stated that when they came here, the American Indians, the Mayas, the Incas that they met here told them about the Africans who have crossed the Atlantic to the Americans thousands of years ago, who have introduced to them tobacco, what do you call it, bow and arrows and spears and all that stuff with gold ornaments and all that stuff. So Columbus and other Spanish 16th, 15th century Spanish explorers all knew that there had been Africans in the Americas long before they came here. So for you Black Americans talking about, oh, there were blacks here, these blacks who you are talking about right now, you are referring to, were Africans. They were no other than anything but Africans. They were these same Africans that Christopher Columbus and the other Spanish and Portuguese explorers were referring to in their journal, having heard these same stories from the American Indians, that these Africans were the Africans who built this some of their civilizations. Talking about the Olmec heads. I mean, you go to Mexico and you see these Olmec heads. You go to the other parts of the Americas, Central America and South America, and you see all these Olmec heads that you see depicting of Africans, pure Africans with broad nose, big faces, broad faces, and all that stuff. You know what I'm saying? So these were Africans who had migrated on their own, crossed the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas, long before Christopher Columbus. As a matter of fact, there's also a history of how Mansa Musa, the wealthiest man ever on earth today, Mansa Musa, even considering inflation and everything, when you talk about wealth, how he came onto the throne of the Mali Empire after his brother, who had migrated with some slaves and Africans and servants from the Mali Empire, crossed the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. So there's even the story is already there. And there are facts, and that has been proven that the Africans had traveled thousands of years long before Columbus and other Portuguese and Spanish explorers came to America. So if you want to claim that your ancestors, not all your ancestors are slaves, which is true, the blacks that were here were also Africans. They were not that different from the Africans who were enslaved later. At the end of the day, every black person came from Africa, period. So they were also Africans. You know, so I don't want to hear this notion where people talk about, oh, there were black people here before slavery and therefore, no. Yes, of course, there were black people here. Christopher Columbus said it himself. He had it in his journal talking about what he had encountered with the American Indians. And American Indians themselves also talk about the civilizations that these people brought along with them to the Americas. So yes, by the end of the day, it's not that different. They were all Africans. That's what it is. So whether they were Africans before Columbus or Africans after Columbus, at the end of the day, they are still Africans. So it's still the same thing. Now, but I can also understand why some of these people have this depiction, you know, this anger when they call them African Americans. And it's a choice. I mean, nobody is forcing anybody to be called anything. At the end of the day, it started with the history of America, the way Black Americans were considered second-class citizens. If you look at the American history, every race in America can trace their ancestry to either Europe, Asia, or somewhere in this world. It was only the African American, the black man, because of slavery, who could not trace their ancestry to any particular country in Africa. So there has to be a reason why this term was coined. The term was coined because of that. They didn't coin the term Nigerian American or Senegalese American, Ethiopian American, Kenyan American, all that stuff. Because at the end of the day, slaves were brought from Africa. And they couldn't pinpoint exactly which country all these slaves came from because of the nature of slavery. So for them to come up with this term, it has to be broadened to the continent where these slaves came from. And that is why the term African American befits Africans and Black people in America. But you go back to history of America also. Even European Americans, when they first came to this country, were called by their native countries, period. You had German Americans, Irish Americans, Scottish Americans, Italian Americans. That's how they were called, because they all came from these countries in Europe. So they were described and identified based on the country they came from. But as time went by and the whites assimilated within this country, then eventually they now started calling them Caucasians or whites. So nobody have to identify by their country of origin. So this notion that you don't want to be called African American because your ancestors built America and they fought all American wars and all that stuff. Yes, I get that. It is true. It's like a slap in the face at this modern day in America when you see your people being called African American, whilst other people like Europeans are not identified as European Americans. Yes, I get that. I understand that. But you also have to look at the context under which that name came about. Because you were always treated as a second-class citizen. You were always treated differently from these European Americans. Other than that, everybody will be called American American. But that's not the issue. The issue is not about if everything was on the same playing field, level playing field. It wasn't like that. Black people had always been treated differently. Black people were not even considered citizens of America. They were never considered citizens of America all the way until the world. Even the 14th Amendment, abolition of slavery, later years before blacks were even considered citizens. So at the end of the day, you have to look at the context under which these names, terms like African American, came to be. And it came to be because of the past history of America. So to re-energize the pride of Black Americans in America, Jesse Dashlin, W. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, and all these people believe that the only way for us to get the respect that we need, we have to look back to our great civilizations of Africa, the heritage of Africa that Africa has given to the world. The great civilizations of Egypt, Ethiopia, the North civilization of Nigeria, the Songhai Empire in middle of Africa, central, north, east, and west of Africa, all of that. So we have to use the term African American to depict our pride of Africa, but not because we're using that term just because we want to use the term African American. No, it goes back to the history of America. That is why that term was coined. But yes, everybody knows that you're African American, you are still a black person. At the end of the day, it doesn't even matter whether you call yourself African American or you call yourself a Black American. If you are walking down the street as a black man, you are still a black man. And every black man has his or her ancestry to Africa, period. So regardless of how you want to call yourself, whether you are yellow, albino, or whatever, at the end of the day, you still have the features of a black man. And a black man is an African. And that's what it is. I mean, going back, talking about that story, that issue is, let me clarify this also. So basically now, for people like Smokey Robinson and what they are saying, then you go back and say, okay, Barack Hussein Obama is the real first African American president, based on their analogy, because in this case, then Barack Hussein Obama, who happens to be his father to be a Kenyan, and the mother being a white woman from Kansas, now he's a true African American, because with him, his father is African. So he can claim African American. So the first real African American president is Barack Hussein Obama. I mean, he's not just a black man, he's an African American president, is Barack Hussein Obama, because of his father being African. You know what I'm saying? But we don't say that. We say he's the first African American president, and we are all proud of that, right? We don't say that because his father is from Kenya and his father is African. Oh, he's different from the black Americans who have slavery ancestry here. We don't say that. But we are all proud of Barack Hussein Obama being the first black president, right? So, I mean, we can't have it both ways, fellas. We can't have it both ways, okay? At the end of the day, like I stated earlier, it doesn't matter whether you're a black man or you call yourself African or you call yourself whatever, Caribbean, American, whatever, you are still a black man. And every black man, including even every race, pretty much have their ancestry to the motherland, Africa. So, fellas, if I'm going to end this show today, we as black people or African Americans or whatever you want to call yourself, we have more important things to talk about in this country in terms of building wealth, in terms of having more economic and political power in America that we have to focus on. Because at the end of the day, if everything's about power, and if you want to be heard, and if you want to be respected in any society, I don't care whether it's in America, Africa, Asia, or Europe, you also have to have the financial backing to be able to dictate, to be able to be stronger and more politically acknowledged and accepted in that community. You have to have that economic background. Because if you don't have that strong economic power, you can have the numbers in terms of the population, but you're still not going to control any political system in any country. Because you have people in America who are very minority in America in terms of population, but because of their economic power, they control the politics of this country. So at the end of the day, let's focus on building wealth so that we can have our economic power dictate the political process in America to help build Black America or African American in this American community. Rather than focusing on whether I want to be called African American or called Black American or called whatever, Caribbean American or whatever. Look, it's all about power. And the only way you can get power in any society is to build economic wealth. And that is where we have to focus on. So we can also be able to sit at the table and dictate how things can be in America to benefit Black, African American, or whatever you want to call yourself. So thank you guys for listening to this program this beautiful Sunday. Have a great week and God bless you guys. Peace and love. And I'll see you guys next weekend.